Greetings, my name is JC. I am the Game Master for our Castles and Crusades campaign that is being run currently in Fantasy Grounds using the Barrow Maze Complete module. So in this video, I wanted to go over a little bit more detail since I promised my players this, and I figured it'd be just an interesting video in general on the combat options basically in Castles and Crusades, just so that everybody can kind of get an idea of what's available, so it's not necessarily just attack and move or cast a spell or use an ability. It is more complex than that, and there are other options available to you. So this video is only going to be basically going over those different options and a few other things that are related to the discussion. If you want to know how to play Castles and Crusades, especially if you're one of my players in my current ongoing campaign, I have another video on my channel called Castles and Crusades Basic Rules, which is about 50 minutes, and it explains everything from the skills and class abilities to basic combat actions, dying, saving throws, and some examples of combat and stuff like that to sort of walk you through how that sort of works in Fantasy Grounds. So if you're curious about those, then that's where you can find that. It also has a house ruled initiative modified system that I've done, which is essentially the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons weapon speed factor rules that we are using in Castles and Crusades, if you're curious about it. Anyway, so without further ado, let's begin. So all the information in this is obviously from the rulebooks, and I have access to most of the rulebooks for Castles and Crusades from Fantasy Grounds themselves, and I've gotten the PDF from their website, and if you own the PDF, I don't actually have the PDF for the Castle Keeper's Guide. I only have actually like this version of it to read through the different rule book. So I can't give you a page number for if it's from the Castle Keeper's Guide, but all these rules are only in the what I'll call core rules, air quotes on that, from the Player's Handbook and the Castle Keeper's Guide. And basically it's like page 169 in the Player's Handbook, like onwards for that like entire like chapter. And it's a lot of it's from chapter 17 from the Castle Keeper's Guide. So first off is movement. I explained this in a previous video, but I wanted to just reiterate it since it is important. Whenever you're moving, you can only essentially move up to your allotted movement. So I'm using Grug as an example in our kind of explanations here today, and he'll be doing his examples against this gargoyle and hill troll. So Grug's basic movement due to his encumbrance is 20. So what he is able to do is make a half move action and still get an attack. So in this case, it would be like 10 feet. Okay. Or he could make a full move, which would be the full 20. Or what he could do is he could jog, which is like a double move, or what some of our players are calling like a dash. And this is terminology from a different edition. And basically what that does, this is a DM ruling based off of just kind of like logic I've kind of put in. If you do a jog, in this case it would be 25 feet to 40 feet for Grug based off of his movement rate, you would get a -2 AC until the beginning of his next round. And my rationale on this is because you're basically you're not doing a full charge, which is a worse penalty and a bonus to damage, which I'll get to in a second, but you're not necessarily completely focusing on your defense because you're hastily moving. So I'm doing half of the penalty of charge for AC with no other bonuses or penalties for doing a jog. And the last thing that you can do with movement is what is known as a charge. And so what a charge is you have to move at least your full movement, so at least 20 for Grug in this case. And then it has to be in a relatively straight line. So it doesn't have to be necessarily be like, okay, well, I want to charge the troll. That's a straight line. Like, it doesn't have to be exactly like a straight line like that. Like, obviously, like I could go like this and that's more or less a straight line and you could still do the charge action. As long as you move at least 20 to 40 feet And the repercussions of it is basically you get -4 to your armor class until the beginning of your round, and you get +2 to damage whenever you hit. There's no penalty or bonus to hit, just a bonus for extra damage, basically, from that charge action. So with charge and other movements, those are really the only available options that I am using for our players. If you're more familiar with Castles and Crusades, or if you're reading through the rulebook, you might see an option which allows you to move 4 times your movement. For the purposes of our campaign, I've turned that off, which I mentioned in my last video, and the reasoning behind that is just because a lot of the movement, if moving 4 times speed, just doesn't really like necessarily work, because then it just doesn't feel right for the style of play that we're playing. Essentially, that's kind of the long and the short. And so those are kind of all the available options for movement in Castles and Crusades. And yeah, so let's move on to the next topic. The next topic is combat actions. So in the previous video, I went over attacks and spells and some other very basic things, but it was really like if you've played Final Fantasy or the first time you played Dungeons and Dragons, it was just really like you can make an attack roll or use one of your abilities that's like a style of attack depending on your class and stuff like that. Like read your character's abilities in order to figure what those out are. And so since there's more options than just these basic attacks and being able to cast spells and stuff like that, there's always options for more flavor. And not necessarily everybody uses them, but I really enjoy these types of combat options. And now that we've played for quite a few sessions and we kind of have gotten our feet wet with this system and sort of know the basic intricacies and stuff like that, I think it's sort of time just to open sort of the gates, and I'll go through and start using many of the combat options. As my dungeon mastering style always entails, as a reminder for my players especially, and recommendations for other dungeon masters potentially listening to this, it's always a two-way street. Bad guys can use multi-shot with range, and so can the good guys, and they have to follow the same rules that you have to play by. If you think it's unfair as a player for the bad guys, well, use it against them. And never over abuse these, I would say, as a DM, because sometimes it can kind of get monotonous. Before I begin, the one thing to understand is, unlike 3rd edition or Pathfinder especially, in the basic rules in 5th edition, Castles and Crusades is kind of written assuming that you're using facing rules. And then so we're using the bottom of the actual token, like this is where he is facing, and in order to figure out where they're facing. Because if I draw a circle here, like these are the front 3 squares. These are known as side squares. This is the rear square, and then these are rear flank squares. So if you're in a different facing, you get different bonuses passively based off of where you attack from. And with the combination of understanding that and understanding the different options, you can kind of use all of these tools in your toolkit in order to basically make combat more successful for yourself and your allies, in order to basically use your combat advantages to mitigate some of the action economy in the game based off of the facing and stuff like that. And if you're not using facing, or if you don't really want to use facing, honestly, I would suggest you just play a different edition. Or you're going to really need to house rule your own like Pathfinder or 3X style rules into this. And I'm following the rules. So if you're in a rear square, so let's just get the combat tracker open and we will use Lutz as an example. So if Lutz and Grug were attacking each other, all 6 of these squares are normal attack bonuses, but passively, if you're in this square, which is the like the like the flank or here is known as a flank as well, you get a +1 to your bonus. Okay, so you can manually do that, or you can add the modifier and then roll your dice, and it will automatically, or your attack, most likely you should probably be rolling your attack, and in order to attack, and in order to automatically calculate that. In behind, you get a +2 bonus whenever you're in the rear square. And for my players, anytime during your turn, it's much like Final Fantasy Tactics, you can reface basically at the end of your turn. So if Lutz wanted to come in and attack a Grug for some reason and get the +2 bonus to attack, and perhaps he made Grug unconscious due to dealing enough damage to him, at the end of his turn, he could reface in order to make sure that his rear square isn't going to be as easily accessible to other people. And this is kind of like with the action economy that I've sort of been working with my players, and I just kind of wanted to go over some of that a little bit because I feel it's really important. And so you might have 10 movement with your character, and still be able to attack, which I went over in movement. So what you could do is move 5 and then 10, and then reface to attack Lutz, and you are in the flank square, giving you a +1. And it's kind of like a dance, so to speak, where like he might reface and then attack you, but then you could go like 5 and then 10, and then be in the +1 square again, due to the amount of movement that they can move with still being able to get in their attack. And so those are things that you want to consider, because consider every pip on a d20 is 5%. So if you get a +1, you're increasing your chance by 5%. It might not sound significant, but once you get to 10 or 15% based off of the abilities that you're stacking and then adding it in, like it does add up, and it is significant, and it's just things to consider, especially if some of these creatures, as the players have noticed, like ghouls can paralyze you for an extraordinarily long time if those get up to you and manage to get in some hits, and you being paralyzed isn't overly helpful for the group. So you're going to want to basically kill the foes as quick as possible by mitigating all the action economy effectively. So the other thing to consider is it's vague as to whether or not this is a rule or not. If you can cite me to a place where it actually does this, then let me know. But I'm only giving these bonuses for melee attacks. So hurled attacks, which are ranged, so like you're throwing an axe, or ranged attacks, like a bow, which would be a dexterity-based attack, do not get these whenever you're firing into the squares. So those are the main things that you need to consider whenever you are moving around the board. Also, in addition to this, there's something called reach. And passively, you would potentially get this if you're using a certain type of item. And so these rules for reach are from chapter 17, the combat chapter in the Castle Keeper's Guide. And essentially any pole arm gives you advantage in ties for initiative. So if Lutz is attacking Grug and he's using a pole arm, and Grug is using his bearded axe, which is not a pole arm, basically anything that has like a reach factor, which they define basically as pole arms. So if it makes sense that the weapon would have reach, then yes. But you're not able to reach with like your sword just to get this. This is passively pole arms do this. And you both are on 5 for the initiative. Irregardless of you matching up a tie for, let's say Lutz has a +1 dexterity and Grug has a +0 dexterity. On a tie, normally what would happen is Lutz would go first because his dexterity is quicker on the tie. At least that's how I handle it. This rule would supersede that if one of those characters had the pole arm. The pole arm would supersede a character who had better dexterity just because he has that reach. In addition to some passives that are sort of in situational modifiers that are onto the game table, if you are prone or blind, if the defender's prone or blind, then basically the person gets a +5. And so here, this is a screenshot from the PDF. These are the different things. So if there are prone or defenseless, you get a +10 to hit them. And then if you are lower elevation, which we haven't actually had any things that really deal with elevation, you get a +1. So technically, in a recent combat where they went to a bridge with 2 towers with archers on them, by the rules, they should have gotten a +1, but they weren't getting a +1 because it just wasn't giving it to them. But that is a potential rule that's out there. Defender stunned or is cowering, which is an effect, is 2. Defender invisible or the attacker is blind. They get a 10 penalty. Melee attack from mounted combat or an unstable platform is -2. Ranged combat from a mount is -4. And then there's different types of concealment. And these are the rules for concealment. So there's quarter, a third, a half, or full cover, -2, 4, 6, and 10 respectively. I don't know if personally I would ever really say, oh, it's a third cover, but I might say like you have half cover or you have full cover. I'll be honest, we haven't really used the cover rules, but if it, I guess, circumstantially comes up, then this is how it is done and what the bonus would be, according to whether like me as the castle keeper determines whether like the cover is relevant or not. All right, so I just want to interject in here where we're talking about the defender is prone or defenseless. As I went through, you notice it's a 10. Moving forward, we are going to be using the rulebook for Castles and Crusades, so it's more of a C&C style instead of a first edition style. So what a lot of dungeon masters do, for context, in older editions, at least that I have met, is if a person is defenseless or helpless, you can coup de grace them. And coup de grace was gotten rid of from the system because it's kind of overpowering and players love to use it until it's used against them. And I'm going to be honest with any players that are listening, it would have been eventually used against you, which is basically an instant kill, like -10. So, and then you would need to get resurrected. And I honestly don't think that's fair, and I think it's harsh enough as the way it's set with both how Castles and Crusades work and how the campaign setting rules kind of interlace with it from the Barrow Maze. So moving forward, this is the rule for our players that we're going to be using. Coup de grace is not a thing that is going to exist anymore. I'm sorry, I know sleep / coup de grace is super OP, but yeah, not moving forward. Basically, you're going to get a +10, which is essentially an automatic hit, unless you roll a 1. And yeah, so anyway, okay, so let's get into the normal combat actions for what you can do with melee and ranged attacks. So obviously there is the normal attack, which is just a roll to hit, and then if you actually hit, then you just roll for damage, which is essentially you move up to the person, and if it's half of your movement, then you can select the target, and then you would, let me just make sure that Grug has the correct selected target, and then so you'd be able to roll, and then on a hit you would deal damage, and then everything would be fine. And obviously if I was in this square, it'd be a +1, and then if it would be this square, it would be a +2, obviously, because that's the rear square and the flank squares. So that's sort of what we've been doing. In addition, there is multi-attack, and so everybody was aware of this, but nobody is using it, and I'm not necessarily recommending that non-fighters use this, because the penalties are sort of harsh, and like it doesn't really make sense for a wizard to be dual wielding daggers, for example, but like it is possible, but it's going to be a lot harder for them to do for like a trained fighter who knows how to use like weapons and stuff. So you just have to abide by the weapons that your class restriction is, and you can equip 2 weapons essentially, and then one of the weapons you choose into the primary hand, and then the other one you choose into the secondary hand. So you would actually need like a secondary item. So if I quickly just add in a sword over on our character here, What I'm going to say is Grug is going to use the Bearded Axe in his primary hand, and Grug is going to be using the Longsword in his secondary hand. So the base math on this is that the primary hand attack is -3 and the secondary one is -6. And then so this is going to interlace with all of your existing modifiers, whether you have magical equipment like a +2 or +1 longsword, or your base attack bonus. Like, obviously all this math works together, but just at a base level, here's kind of the 3 big options and examples that you can kind of sort of go through to sort of explain how this works. So knowing that these offset them by dexterity and any class abilities like the fighter's weapon specialization and the to hits. The example is like, for example, a first level fighter without a dex bonus in these examples would have a +1 to hit due to his weapon specialization, which is a class ability, and his +1 to hit due to his level. And so what he would get is -1 and -4 respectively on the primary and then secondary hand after you do the math. And then so as you level, if you're 5th level, this fighter in the example still has a +1 from weapon specialization because it doesn't bounce up until the next level. And then he would gain +5 because he's a 5th level character, and that's how fighters progress on the to-hit chart. And so he would roll a +3 on his primary hand and a +0 modifier on the secondary hand based off of those modifiers. And then a 7th level, it's basically this has jumped up to +2 because of how the weapon specialization ability works, and this is what I'm talking about. How at 7th level eventually it gets to +2 to hit and +2 to damage, and before it was +1 and +1. That's what I'm kind of referring to, just so you're aware. The bonuses would be +6 and then +3 respectively for the primary hand and then the secondary hand. And so those are kind of the 3 examples that I can kind of come up with. Okay, so the one thing to consider about these abilities in the stack is that the way that weapon specialization works, just so that you understand, and the reason why I'm going through this in detail is because I have players that this is kind of covering. You're choosing a specific type of weapon. And like, for example, Grug's weapon specialization is a bearded axe. So if he used 2 bearded axes, he would gain the weapon specialization bonus. But obviously, if he had a bearded axe and a short sword on his character, then he would only gain his weapon specialization on the bearded axe because of the way that the rules work. Okay, so if you made a character who was specialized in like short swords because you liked how that worked, and then basically you would gain your weapon specialization for them. So like, always make sure that you're covering the rules for each of the different things, but just understand that all of this works in unison. So what you can do is you can actually hit this magnifying glass and then modify the math here so that your attack is actually correct, because what this is basically it's a melee attack with 7, and there's a +1 in here for the specialization. So technically, like, this at level 5, so it's a +1. So like, his attack bonus is +8 at the moment based off of all the factors in here, because like, he has a strength of 2, and like, it's all like working in here, because that's why Fantasy Grounds is so great. So what you would need to do is basically you would need to offset this to, I guess, -2 here, because the first primary is -3 obviously, and then if you had another bearded axe, then what you could do is you could offset that so that it calculates with the -6 correctly. But just make sure that all of your abilities and stuff like that, especially like for us, we're using the advantage system, so you might gain some advantages, like this guy is Cleaving Strike, for example, which isn't applicable here, but there are some advantages that are combat advantages which will help supersede these types of things. So just make sure, and I will help you guys do this, but just be cognizant of that. You guys have been pretty good at it, but that the math is done correctly. And if you want to see it, then that's kind of how you go through, and then you can just hit that magnifying glass in case you weren't aware. So that's how multi-attack works for like two-handed attacks and melee. Just as a note, if you have or want to play a monk in Castles and Crusades, for any players that are thinking about maybe doing that whenever this character dies or they want to try a new character and stuff like that, there's no pre-gen, but monks do work a little bit differently. So I'll have to go through that a little bit as it goes in, because they get like extra attacks and stuff like that. And the monk just works with it a little bit differently, but for all intents and purposes, you can check out what the rule is and then work it with that. And then so if you gain extra bonus attacks because of your level and being a fighter, for example, this is only for your like primary and your offhand, and then your bonus attacks are just bonus attacks based off of your primary, and that's how that works. Okay, so now let's get into ranged combat, and with ranged combat, there is one of the favorite things that's going on right now with bows. So I'll use Flemeth as an example, since that is the ranger in the campaign. Let me just bring up Flemeth's character sheet. I still have these in here because if I delete them, then all their effects and stuff like that go away. We're sort of like in the middle of stuff. So obviously, with the way that ranged combat works, the rules of your character class or your advantages may supersede some of these rules, so make sure that you understand and read what those are. But there are some passive, basically, modifiers that you need to consider. So there's not really a point-blank shot penalty, and I'm not implementing one. And so keep that in mind. So if you're familiar with those types of rules, that's not a thing. And then basically there's just range incrementations. And with the range incrementations, basically in short range, there's no penalty. In a medium range, there's a -2. And in a long range, there's a -6. Okay. And then past long range, there's basically a penalty of -1 in addition to the 6 every 10 feet. So for example, if your max range based off of calculation was 300 feet, or 300 feet, then 310 feet would be a -7, 320 feet would be a -8, and so on. Just calculate that mathematically. Okay. And then so that works with both bows and crossbows and sort of any type of ranged weapon, because they all have ranged increments. Okay, so you can toss your axe at a medium range, but you're going to be getting likely a penalty if you're not close enough, because their ranges are quite short in comparison to the bows and stuff. All right, so with ranged, it can just be a normal attack, and the normal rules apply. So that would be the fact of like, okay, like Flemeth unencumbered. Actually, I'm pretty sure. Oh, gonna keep that in there because I'm not sure if. So Flemeth with normal weight. We have a cart, so there's some weird things going on with encumbrance, but Flemeth can basically move 10 and shoot. So they could move over here and then shoot against the gargoyle, and then they would roll for their attacks and stuff like that according to like which arrows and stuff like that they're using. And then so one option that they can do is they can do something called a multi-shot. So in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, there is rate of fire, and this is kind of what it's mimicking. All bows shot a rate of fire of 2. And this is all items that have a rate of fire of 1 unless you basically use the multi-shot rules. And as for reference, this is from the Castle Keeper's Guide, Chapter 17, Ranged Combat, if you're curious to get more specifics about it. But basically, if you want to shoot more than one round, you have to use an action to pre-position your attack and basically to like get ready. And then so that is an action. So she would be able to move like the 10 up to here and then use her action to basically get ready. And then what that does is it spends her action basically to get all of the arrows that are on her self, like her in her backpack and in her quivers and stuff like that, at the ready. So maybe the arrows are sticking in the ground in front of her, or like she props up a quiver up to a box beside her or something like that, so that there's quick, easy access. Because if you've done any archery and in a 10-second round, you can shoot more than one arrow in 10 seconds. It is very feasible after some practice. Basically what happens is each shot gives you a concurrent penalty of -1. Okay, so here is the screenshot of the chart. So if you look at this chart, by the rules, the way that it works is -1, 2, 4, and 8. It's kind of exponential. What I'm doing is a DM rule, and so it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, that's how we're running it. That's not actually by the rules. But that's how we're running it. And if it's going to be too OP, we'll revert to the real rules. But for now, it's via the house rule. And then if you attack a target and you kill it, you can move on to the next target. Okay? So if Flemeth was attacking this, and after her second attack, she killed the gargoyle, her third and fourth attack could be on the troll. The only trick to this whole entire system is that basically she can't move, okay? And still get fire shots. If she were to move, then it basically she picks up her prepositioned like attack area, and she loses that and she moves away, okay? And so the other option is multi-shot with crossbows. So if you have a loading lever, which is an item that you can buy, basically it gives you an attack rate of 2 per round because you're using the loading lever, but you have to abide by the rules of the ready station. Okay? So you use an action to create your ready station. So for example, Tem in our campaign uses a crossbow. So if Tem wanted to use her crossbow 2 attacks per round, then she would basically have to ready that as an action, and then the following round, then what would happen is basically she would be able to get 2 attacks per round. And then if she moved away from her ready station, like part of that movement is packing up the ready station and moving out, and then she'd be limited again to the 1 attack per round, just as per the bow. Okay, so that is how multi-shot works with both of the different types of like dexterity style weapons. If you're going to be using multiple attacks with hurled weapons, they fall under the multi-attack melee rules. So keep that in mind. And basically what that means, you can hurl an axe, and if you want to hurl 2 axes, you're essentially dual wielding 2 axes, so you get -3, -6 on base, and then you do all of your modifiers. Okay, that's how that system works. So it actually isn't part of the multi-shot rules; it's part of the multi-attack rules. Okay, so we've gone over the multi-shot rules and ranged combat in a little bit more detail, and now let's go over sort of some of the actual combat tactics themselves. The combat tactics themselves, so far, we've actually used a few of them, and all of these rules are either in Chapter 17 in the Castle Keeper's Guide, like it's the combat chapter, or they're from like around page like 170 to 180 in the Player's Guide. I'll reference the actual page number if it's specifically from the Player's Guide as they come up, though, for your reference. All right, so any of these actions are just that. They're actions. And so before I begin, any of these following actions actually can be done by any type of weapon, whether it's a hurled weapon, a ranged weapon, or a melee weapon. Any of these are fair game for them unless otherwise specified. All right, so the first option is called shot. And so this is from the Castle Keeper's Guide. I can do this with a bow, a hurled weapon, or a sword, okay? And Call Shot is really interesting. And this is from chapter 17 of the Castle Keeper's Guide, if you want more information on it. And it doesn't allow you to do like a called shot to like an eye or something like that to make them blind, or like to their leg to pin them down, or like cool actions like that a lot of players try and sort of like mitigate the rules to try and gain advantages, because that's really what players are doing whenever they're doing that. They're sort of trying to game the system. That's kind of not like the spirit of the game. So I'm not going to be allowing that type of stuff. And the way that it actually works is basically you make a called shot as your action, and then you make an attack with whatever weapon that you want with a -8 to hit, and on a successful hit, then the hit is a crit. And so basically this is just assumed that you're hitting like a pressure point or a known weak location or something like that, and it will do extra damage, okay? It doesn't give them an effect or anything like that. It just turns into a crit. So with Flemeth, for example, with her bow, she has a +6 to attack. So if she wanted to do a cold shot against the gargoyle, then effectively she would get a -2 to her attack roll. So she would be able to make one attack roll with the bow, and then if successful, she basically rolls crit damage. And everybody has their own house rules for crit. The Castle Keeper's Guide has some suggestions for crits. What we're doing is it's double whatever the damage is after everything. So if you do 1d6 plus 2 and 1d4 fire damage for your sword's attack, whatever you roll after all those modifiers, I just double the number, and that's how we roll critical hits. I wanted critical hits to be exciting and to be super dangerous at the same time, so that's why I've done that house rule. Okay, so that's what would happen with it. So if Grug wanted to do a called shot with his bearded axe, then basically what he has a +8 to attack with his weapon as a level 5 character, and so basically he would just get an attack with no modifier, and then if he hits, then the damage would be crit damage. So it's a pretty significant thing, but you can't do... It's just one attack. You can't do multi-shot with it. You can't do multi-attacks with it. It's just you're swinging with your one chosen weapon, or shooting with your one chosen weapon, and that's the penalty and the boon for doing a called shot. All right, so this is going to be new, and one of the reasons why we're implementing this rule, and this is from the Castle Keeper's Guide, the combat section as well, is close supporting fire. So I was explicit in saying that there is no firing into melee. I don't really care about it. One of the reasons why I didn't want to care about it was just to get people's feet wet so that they started to understand the rules, and we're going to add them, as I did mention many times, more as we go, which is what this is. Now the combat module is fully open. So now whenever you're firing into melee, so for example, if Flemeth were to fire into melee on this gargoyle, anyone who is in the surrounding 8 squares is considered underneath like close supporting fire range. So on a 1, it's always a miss. It doesn't matter. But on a 2 to 4 for any of the rolls, okay, it could potentially hit an ally. All right. So if we have it only one ally, obviously it's them. But if I grab another character, and let's pretend Lutz is here, the way that this would work is that basically it's a 50% chance. So the character would say, okay, on 1 to 3, it's Grug. On 4, 5, 6, it's Lutz. Roll into the in here. Boom. 4. Okay, I might hit Lutz. And then what happens is basically they reroll again to try and see if they hit for the attack that they did. All right. And then if they would hit Lutz's armor class, or the person who they're now targeting's armor class, because they rolled the 2 to the 4, then they will damage that one character. So firing into melee is going to be a lot more dangerous. And this will come to a shocker to our party, especially since we've started to realize the power of the multi-shot. And that's really the reason why I am turning on close supporting fire. And keep in mind, as a reminder, I'm doing 1, 2, 3, 4 for the penalties, not 1, 2, 4, and 8. All right, for now. So the thing is that with this, if you remember the combat that happened whenever we attacked the bandit camp, there was a lot of people in melee whenever the archers were firing into melee. So they actually did roll some 2s and 3s and 4s on their things. With this had turned on, they would have been hitting their friends. So it's a two-way street. It's always a two-way street. Always remember that. So next is offensive focused. So this is similar to a called shot, and offensive focus is basically, it doesn't have as big of a penalty, but it doesn't result in a crit. All right. So with offensive focus, which is from the Castle Keeper's Guide, Chapter 17, Combat section, basically you can make a single attack that you focus on. All right. And what you gain is a +3 to hit because you're focusing, but the penalty is you get -6 to your armor class. All right. So it's kind of like taking a little bit of extra time to get that bonus to hit, but I mean, you are taking the repercussion of like, okay, I'm going to be easier to hit because I'm so focused on actually trying to hit. And so where would I use this? We've fought a lot of monsters so far that are 18 and 20 armor class. And because of the progression of the way that the 2 hits, the rogues and the wizards could not hit them. So if they want to do an offensive focus with their dagger or their sling, for example, they can do that. Again, these can happen with any of the 3 main types of attacks, but they're going to be a lot easier to hit. So like the wizards wearing cloth are going to have an armor class of 4. That's just what's going to happen. It may or may not come up. You'll have to find out. But it'll make it a lot easier for them to be able to hit the characters. Maybe you want to take a bigger penalty because you only hit on a 20. So if I have a -8 to hit, I'm just going to do Cold Shot 2. Sure, that's fine. But keep in mind, a +3 is 15% probability increase in order to hit that person. And if you stack that with the actual facing rules, which we're using. So if Lutz were to go 5, 10, and then focus over to here so that he's in the flank square for the gargoyle, he would get +4 to attack if he used an offensive focus. Okay, so he get +1 for the flank, and then +3 for the actual offensive focus, and then damage is normal. Okay, if he somehow managed to get into the rear square, obviously the net result would be +5, +2 from the rear, plus square, +3 from the offensive focus, and then he would gain a penalty of -6 for armor class, which is going to affect him, but it could potentially help down characters faster. So that's the thing that you got to consider. Okay, but and the thing to consider is that like a spell that we've already used, like Shield of Faith, and this is really where the thinking comes in, gives a bonus to armor class of 2. So if Lutz were to cast Shield of Faith on themselves, because it's a spell that they have, the penalty would then be -4, obviously, right? From the 6, because the bonus of the 2. And so those are the things that you're going to have to consider. And like, so our main tank in the group is Nikias, who is kind of like a fighter type character. And so he already has a super high armor class, right? So that's something that you're going to want to consider with the rules, especially with the shield +1 against 2 of the targets and stuff like that in the rules that we're using and stuff. So offensive focus is going to make those harder to hit, like bosses, air quotes on bosses, or named characters, air quotes on named characters. Just the ads in this battle map that are the higher hit dice monsters, basically. A lot easier to hit, but they're going to be able to hit you back, so watch out. All right, so the next thing that you can do is either an evade or a parry. And so this is what we've been calling defensive stance. And so what defensive stance is, it's from page 177 of the player's handbook. And basically, as your action, you can just hunker down and then you will get a +4 to armor class. Okay, that's really significant. There is no other penalty other than you have to use your action, and it basically foregoes your attack. And whenever you have enough DPS in the group, like let's say Flemeth is attacking here with her multi-shot with her 4 arrows per round, and then Lutz is constantly trying to stay in the flank or the rear square of this gargoyle. Grug can really, unless aggro is pulled due to like my own way that I dungeon master, Grug can really hunker down and then make sure that he can sort of take the hits from this gargoyle, which might be like a really strong creature for them to fight. Or I guess in this case, Grug. And so, yeah, that's what we're calling defensive stance, but it's really called evade or parry, and it gives you a +4 to armor class. And so the next option is something that came up once, but is also something that is potentially possible for you to do. And where this is important is that whenever you might have too many characters around you, you might want to get some of them away from you to make them waste their action economy, basically. Because as you have probably started to notice more and more as we play more and more complex battles, as we gain up in level, action economy is king, especially with like making sure that you get in as much CC as possible and stuff like that. There's an action that you can do called push, and this is from chapter 17 of the Castle Keeper's Guide, combat chapter. Basically, this allows you to drive a foe back in a straight line 5 or 10 feet. And then so let's move Lutz over to the side here. So what this will do is you basically make an action to push, and then you could push this guy here, and then you can move him back 5 or 10. And that's basically your choice. I don't know why you wouldn't do 10 feet, but since we're playing on a grid and it's not like Mind's Eye, or like we're not using like just by the foot measuring and stuff like that, which you could do if you use like miniatures a la like Warhammer style or something like that, because this rule system can definitely use combat terrain that way if you're playing like at a table, but we're using Fantasy Grounds, so it's not as easy to do. You make an attack roll at a -2 penalty, all right, and then on a hit of their armor class, basically the defender then makes a strength check, all right, and this is going to be harder for them if it's a secondary ability for them, or if it's a primary ability, it'll be easier. And again, a primary base number is 12 for ability check, and a secondary is 18 base for the skill checks. And then there's a lot of rules for modifying as to what or not is going to be easy. And then so check out the other video where I explain a little bit about ability checks in Siege Engine and how that works if you want more information on it, or do some reading in the player's handbook. And then so if they fail that check, they're kicked back the 5 or 10 feet. All right. So obviously, if there's a wall here or a rock, then like you're not going to be able to push them onto the rock, or they're not going to go up 5 feet. So maybe they'll stop. So that's kind of why it's like 5 or 10 feet. And if you push them over a cliff, they could potentially take fall damage. So that is a tactic that you can do. So the other combat where we were on the bridge map, where there was the 2 towers, and Nikias ran up into the tower, what he could have done. So actually, I'll bring that up. So we were on this map here on the broken bridge, and then this was able to climb up, all right? So Nikias, and we'll put a gargoyle here. We were fighting bandits, but this is basically what the scenario was. So what could have happened was, let's say he was here, because that would have been higher. I explained that this was a story and a half tall, so that was about like 15 feet or something, okay? And these guys didn't have a lot of hit points. So in this case, it might not have really mattered. An attack would have been better. But let's say this is 30 feet high, all right? You could have done a push action and then you make your check, and then they make their strength check, and they failed it, let's just say, they would have moved back 5 feet and would have fallen, and if it was 30 feet, they would have taken 3d6 points of damage, okay? And then if it's a harder to kill character, like a 5 or 7 hit dice monster, that's a tactic that you're going to want to consider. That is an option that's available to you, all right? So let me just delete these tokens so that it's all not confusing the next time I open up this map. And let's go on to the next action. That is Disarm. So Disarm is from the player's handbook on page 176. And this is actually something that's restricted to specific classes, okay? So this is only available to fighters, knights, rogues, assassins, clerics, and paladins. And so if you're using some of the other books, if they fall underneath, like if they're an archetype of, like they're a type of assassin, for example, like there's some world books that are available that have some extra classes and stuff like that. Like some of these books down here, for example, like some of them are assassins and some of them are fighters and stuff like that. Your castle keeper will be able to figure that out using a judgment call. But if they cover those classes, again, fighter, knight, rogue, assassin, cleric, or paladin, all right, they're able to use a disarm. And then so what a disarm is you can do it with anything that is holding or wielding a weapon. You can't disarm a bear, for example. You can't disarm its claws, okay? Maybe you can cut his paws off, but like that's just not something that you can do in the system. But if you're fighting a bandit and he has a short sword, you could potentially disarm him. All right. In addition, disarm is something that is a melee action. So this is the only thing that is really stringent on the melee action, as well as like obviously the push. And so what you do is you make an attack roll, okay? And this is like a base attack roll. It's not an attack with one of your weapons. And then so you try and hit AC of 18 plus whatever the hit dice of the creature is. So if you're trying to hit a 3 hit dice bandit, then it would be a 21 to succeed, okay? And if you actually hit that armor class, then basically the target is disarmed and their weapon falls onto the ground, all right? And then so what that means is it kind of makes them lose an action, all right? Because they would have to use their like part of their turn to re-equip that weapon, all right? Depending on how your dungeon master wants to do re-equipping, that could be different per group, but that is something that you can do, which kind of like stumbles along with the character a little bit, and might come up or might be useful depending on like if it's like a big bad guy with like a glowing sword. And obviously like the weapon's on the ground, so if you think about it, he can't do that action to pick up his weapon again if it's not his turn, right? So if Grug disarms the like Death Knight with his glowing dark sword, and then it's Lutz's turn next, what do you think Lutz is gonna do? I'm gonna leave that to your imagination, but disarm might be an interesting thing to do. Yeah. Something else that is new and I am turning on, as well as like the passive and situational conditional modifiers that I went over in the beginning of the video, is disengagement and how it works. One of the first things that the players asked me whenever we started to play was, oh, well, do I get an attack of opportunity? He walked past me, do you get an attack of opportunity? I'm like, well, this system doesn't actually have rules for attacks of opportunity. And that wasn't fully a lie, but there is something called disengagement. And so basically it's a really simple way to do opportunity attacks if you leave melee combat. All right, and we're going to be turning this on moving forward. And so this, if you want more information, is from page 176 in the player's handbook. So what this basically does is if you move away from melee combat, and it's not the rear squares, okay? So, like, let's put these characters like this. this gargoyle is facing this way because of the way that the token is facing. That's how we're working. So if Grug were to say, "Oh, I'm gonna ignore this gargoyle and then walk away, and then walk down here," okay, that's walking away from this target's melee. This would happen if you're in any of the side squares, this square and this square, or any of the front squares to these 3 squares. Okay. So basically, every character gets like a reaction, as it's called in 5th edition. For anybody who disengages without using a disengage action, which is called a hasty disengagement in Castles and Crusades, just to be clear. And so what that means is they get a free attack. But if, let's say, we have Flemeth here and Grug here, and then Grug leaves using a hasty disengagement, meaning they didn't use their action because they wanted to move down here and then make an attack, he wouldn't have been able to use his disengagement ability, and then he'd be able to make his attack here, and then he'd attack the troll, let's just say. The gargoyle uses his reaction basically in order to attack Grug, and then if Flemeth walks away because she's like, I don't want to be in melee with this thing anymore, let's handle this problem. So the reaction, has been used by the gargoyle. He doesn't get one for every character. So this works very similar to how other editions work. Okay. But one thing that, like, if you're a 3rd edition player, you're probably used to, like, okay, if Flemeth walks across here, like as a double move, Flemeth has entered and escaped the reach, basically, of the gargoyle. That doesn't cause an attack of opportunity. We are not doing that. Okay? It's only with the disengagements, which is what now moving forward is going to be something that is going to come up. Okay? And so, for example, if we're fighting a lot of undead in this campaign, this is where something really cool where it will come up. So Lutz can turn undead. So if you're fighting a group of skeletons and a group of ghouls, and Lutz targets the ghouls because they're a little bit more dangerous and manages to turn them, if there is 3 ghouls on Flemeth, okay, and they all leave, Flemeth would be able to get 1 attack on one of those ghouls as they disengage, basically, if they didn't use a disengagement action, okay? And on the meta, the turn would kind of prevent them from using that as an action, so it's going to come up, okay? Or if, for example, a bandit loses its morale check, because I hinted that eventually I will be using morale checks, but I'm not going to be using it all the time. It's just kind of like situational, because it kind of is situational. Some people are just zealous creatures and bad guys who just want to keep on trying to kill those player to characters, right? So they might just, due to a morale break, run away from you, or realize, oh, I need to get this wizard down because they're casting all these funky spells, so I'm just going to walk away from the fighter and then attack the wizard, hoping to get him down in 1 hit because I'm also a powerful fighter. That Nikias, in that case, if they were the front line, would be able to use their once per round reaction to basically hit that person who hastily disengaged. And so how does exactly this work? There's some rules to it. Basically, you can move as far as possible out of melee combat, up to the rules of the distance and stuff like that, which I've gone under. If Lutz were to leave combat like this, these are in the rear squares, this is not a hasty disengagement, because this character can really only affect these 5 squares, okay, as per the way that I'm running it. But if Grug were to leave, all right, then basically what would happen is they would suffer a -2 armor class from the attack, and then they would get that free attack in there if they chose to use it, okay, against this fleeing character. and then the armor class's penalty is only for that one hit against the fleeing character. And then, like, if, for example, it was their turn right after and they moved in, obviously that -2 would no longer be a penalty because it's only part of the hasty disengagement. And then so that's how the hasty disengagement and disengagement rules work in Castles and Crusades, and we will be using those moving forward as of next session, which is pretty exciting. Okay, so those are all of the options and sort of passive rules and combat modifiers and sort of rules that are applicable to combat that we will be using. And I'm just, for sake of completion of this video, to have all this sort of encompassed in the rules, I'm going to go over a couple of things that are rules that just need to be considered in case my players or somebody only watches this video. So Winthana is an illusionist, and Lutz is a cleric. Okay, this is Winthana over here, and this is Lutz. They can cast spells. So casting spells is an action, but one thing to consider about Castles and Crusades is the rules on page 172 are very explicit about this. It's basically first edition rules, and the issue is that whenever you cast a spell, there's no movement allowed. So I just wanted to be explicitly clear about that. There is a rule in the rulebook that says, which is later on in the combat chapter, that generally castle keepers, under most circumstances, should give the opportunity for a person to always be able to move at least 5 feet. Casting a spell, or like the multi-shot rules, are not part of that, because you can't move your station, obviously, so moving 5 feet isn't even going to be an advantage to you. And casting spells, specifically in this section, it says no movement is allowed. So it supersedes that, in case you're aware of that. So that's what I wanted to go over with spells. And then with the spells, it's just you cast your spell according to the rules of the spell and stuff like that, and everything. And I don't really think that's really relevant to this video. So the other thing I wanted to go over is damage. So these are things that have come up that I kind of wanted to have in a video so that it's kind of somewhere in a place for my players to sort of reference. And there's really 2 types of damage that I wanted to talk about. If you want to understand normal damage and how the system works, I talk about like negative damage and stuff like that up to -10 and how a character dies in my previous video. But something that I didn't explain is falling damage. And so this is on page 178 of the Player's Handbook. Basically, if you fall 6 to 10 feet, it's a d6 point of damage, and then every concurrent set of 10 feet, it's another d6, okay? That's very similar, like 90% the same as all the other popular role-playing games. It's basically a d6 every 10, but you don't take any falling damage if you fall 1 to 5 feet, okay? So keep that in mind. And the other thing is subdual damage and how that works. This is in 2 sections. It kind of explains that it can be done in the Player's Handbook on page 178. And the actual rules for this can be found in Chapter 17, Castle Keeper's Guide chapter, where the header is Subdual and Alternate Subdual via Combat. And so here's kind of the Cole's notes of these rules. All right. Basically, you have to declare that you want to do bludgeoning damage. Where this might come up is basically they want to knock out a bandit to basically question him. And then so they wanted to do subdual damage. And then so that's why I went over these rules. So with the subdual damage, it has to be declared first, and it has to be done with a blunt weapon. Okay, you can't do subdual damage with your sword, for example. Okay, some dungeon masters, game masters, castle keepers might allow you to like hit with like the pommel of your sword, for example. But there's technically no rule for how much damage that does. So like maybe it just does like a D2 point of damage or something like that. It's going to be more effective if you do subdual damage and like with like a club or something like that, or like by punching them out. And generally what I do is like if you hit with like the butt of your sword or something like that, it's like a D4 or a D6 point of damage depending on like the size of the weapon or the feeling at the time or something like that. What makes sense to the group, basically. And then so here's some extra rules for subdual damage that are super important. Subdual damage actually also does damage, and it always does a minimum of 1 damage. So if you roll for subdual damage and you do 3 damage, it will do at least 1 damage. If you do 1 damage, it will do an additional point of actual damage, okay? And the way that you know how much actual damage it does is that every set of 5 damage, okay? So 1 to 5 damage, you would do at least 1, and then 10, 15, you do 2 and 3 respectively. It will do real damage, okay? So if you do 15 damage of subdual, you will do 3 additional real damage. And what happens is you have to keep track of the subdual damage and the real damage. And then let's say you have a character with 10 hit points. So if you do 5 subdual damage and 5 real damage, they're at 0 hit points, kind of like air quotes on the 0 hit points, and then they will become unconscious, basically. All right? You can still do more damage to a character if they are knocked out, if they have been done subdual. So keep in mind, like, if you hit somebody subdually and then knock them out, and then the wizard casts Cone of Cold and does a ton of damage to everybody in the area of effect, you might accidentally kill the person who is knocked out. Okay, that's the way it should be done, unless there's some way that you can figure out to mitigate that. Anyway, so the other thing is that if you do too much subdual damage, you could potentially actually kill the person as well. That's something to keep in mind. So if you reach -10 with subdual damage combination, it's actually assumed that you have taken internal organ damage and it has caused death. So maybe your brain hemorrhaged or something like that from the cap to the side of the head, and it killed the character, is kind of like the explanation. Or you hit them in the gut so hard that like their internal stomach was bleeding and they just basically bled out internally. The one thing to keep in mind though is that like let's say if the guy's at 1 hit point and you deal 9 damage to him, that puts him into like that danger zone where like if they're below -7, they lose 1 hit point per round. They're not going to, because they're down via subdual damage, they don't actually lose 1 hit point per round. So you could be sitting at -8 subdual damage from the hit that you did, and they wouldn't go to -9 and then -10 the following rounds, because it's actually subdual damage that's kind of like knocked them out. But if for some reason all of a sudden a fireball comes in and then the real damage ticker gets to -10, they would be dead. All right? So I think that's enough examples to sort of explain the different circumstances of how subdual damage will come up and sort of happen. And our campaign and dealing with other like non-undead creatures like other party members and stuff like that, if that is a thing, or dealing with the bandits and stuff like that. So that's sort of like how subdual damage works. And then how it actually gets healed is essentially you kind of like need to sort of like rest for a little bit. There's no short rests in Castles and Crusades, but it's kind of like if you rest for a short period of time, every 10 minutes of time that has passed as you're kind of like resting, you heal 1 point of subdual damage. So in just being knocked out, I would say is resting. So if you're at like -5 and then 50 minutes go by, you'll be at 0, and then another 10 minutes go by, you'll be at 1. Okay, so because it was subdual damage that knocked you out, the way that I'm going to run it is that you're not needing like a D6 worth of time because you came in from negative hit points, and then you need to rest and then heal all of your hit points, like the rules that we've been doing for like resting and working with the Castles and Crusades system. This will just be like, oh, they're no longer knocked out. They kind of like shook it off, right? Because it is subdual damage, not actual damage. All right, on to the next. So, the rest rules. So this is a house rule that I sort of went over with my group and is an optional rule in a cross between how the rules actually work, how modern editions work, what I think is fair, and how the Adventures in Middle Earth Cubicle 7 5e rules supplements work as well. So I don't like how Castles and Crusades handles rest. It is far too onerous and makes too much time pass by for me to actually care. So these actual rules can be found on page 178 of the Player's Handbook. And if you're curious, in the Lore Master's Guide for Adventures in Middle Earth, if you have access to that book, it's page 50 or in page 57 of that book. And so basically, what I'm saying is you need a good rest, okay? Air quotes on what the good rest is, and I'll define that in a second. And this kind of like follows the terminology of how the Lore Master's Guide Adventures of Middle Earth does this. And if you don't have a good rest, then basically you can't rest. And Castles and Crusades works in the same way, where it's like if you're not actually getting a good rest, the rules actually do state that you don't actually heal, okay? So that's why I reference the Player's Handbook at page 178. So, but I'll get to where the AIME rules kind of come in a second. So if you are in an area of comfort, an area of that's a tranquil location, which is like a aim influence, or if you have safety from a threat, which is also another aim influence, then you can get a good rest. Okay, so an inn is always 1 gold piece per character per night, and then it's an auto rest, and then you can rest, and it's fine. A tranquil location is that like this is a special grove or location. You've actually found 2 of them. The Hearn's Grove or the teleport runes are great examples of this. Or if you a 3rd level wizard spell, Tiny Hut, which I've referenced before, is another good spell where it like creates a tranquil location basically and allows you to rest without needing to worry about anything. Those areas are areas that basically allow you to rest and not worry about it, just like an inn, and you will get your normal rest recovery back when that happens. And then, so the third one is safety from a threat, and there's always a risk of a random encounter whenever this happens. And so this is like your traditional dungeon crawl style Dungeons and Dragons, where you set up your tent with your bedrolls with watches, and you roll for random encounter. Okay, so the way that I've been running this is basically that an encounter may happen, and depending on the circumstance, it could interrupt your rest, okay? Or the rest will actually go through. If no encounter has happened, obviously the rest goes through. If enough rolls on the watch aren't like bad enough, then I'm allowing the full rest to happen, because it's like, oh, it's been 10 minutes of my time. Okay, I'm going to get the full rest. Just to be a little bit more expedient with it is really the reason why I'm doing that. I would think raw rules as written, you would kind of just not get the rest, and you would have to try again for an extra period of time, and your day would start later. That's a way you could run it. And so as long as you have a tent and a bedroll, you have safety from a threat, basically, okay? But there might be a random encounter, where it's risky, because the risk is that your characters might die due to the random encounter. Who knows? And then, so in our house rule, this is very similar to other editions. If you played like Pathfinder, for example, it's 1 hit point per level plus your Constitution modifier. So if you're a 4th level character with a +2 con, 6 hit points. And then you have to do extra healing on top of that, or rest again for another day. Okay? And that's kind of how the rest rules work for us. If you're curious, the aim influence comes in where there's multiple different types of areas, and then if you get into one of those good rest locations, explicitly the tranquil locations, it's kind of an area where it's just safe because it's so sacred or so hidden that there is no way that anything would be able to ambush you. You get a good rest just because of the magic from the stones, or the gods are protecting you in this area, or it's an inn and there's guards, or whatever the case is, right? If you're curious where that influence came from. And so lastly, just as an appendix for informational, since I talked about movement, but only relating to combat, I wanted to add this in to sort of an appendix section for overland movement. And basically, on page 182 in the player's handbook, it explains this. And basically, it explains that 2 miles per hour, if you're unencumbered, is sort of the rules for how far you can travel. And so in our campaign, what we have is the Duchy of Eric, and this is sort of our world map, okay? And then so with this world map, each hex is 5 miles. So really, depending on the terrain, if you just take it by the book, every 5 miles, it would take you 2.5 hours to travel from like here to here to here, basically. Okay, from like the town of Helix to here to here to here. So that'd be 2, 4, 6, like 7.5 hours, basically. And the thing that will change this, obviously, is the terrain, whether it's in the marsh. And I have specific rules that we've kind of gone over as a group as to what the available movement is. But to get an idea, 2 miles per hour unencumbered is kind of the thing. And most people are burdened whenever they're moving, or they have a cart. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the base movement is, because to be honest, most systems use something very similar. So if you want an idea of what the base movement is, Overland, that's kind of what it is. And as a second point for Overland movement, or like, let's say we're in this hex, where the 15 is, and we know there's a bandit camp in here, right? So you might want to like move silently just while you're like searching for the bandit camp in that hex, and then making your rolls in the hex like for a couple of like segmented like actions, let's just say, on the overland movement in order to not get caught. So the rules state that move silently means that the character is attempting to move with making as little noise as possible. And so you're not guaranteed to be 100% silent, but it does slow you down a little bit. And basically, you're able to do that, but the one thing that you have to consider is that it's going to slow you down, so you're not necessarily going to be able to check as much area if you're going to be using those rules. I don't really know how much that will come up, but it is something to consider if you want to sort of like run those rules by the book. So that was a lot of rules. Going over the Castles and Crusades system for combat specifically, in order to sort of go through and thoroughly define what it is that you can do. We went from basically doing just a basic attack or casting a spell, move, and then abilities or items, which is in the previous video, to basically going through all of these different rules and then sort of making it so that we can basically go through the entire different actions and combats. Here's my show notes. Actions and combats to do these basic different attacks and what they sort of mean to the characters and what their player options are. I hope this video was useful. If you as a player found this super useful, then it would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. It tells me that people out there are at least interested in the content, or let me know through Discord or something that you found the video useful, as some of you did with the previous video. And yeah, so I'm going to end the video there. And again, thanks for sticking by, and I hope you enjoy the campaign. This will allow us to do more complex encounters, much like the Bandit Camp one, and sort of mitigate the action economy, and when certain ideas are sort of a little bit better than others and everything. And yeah, I look forward to the encounters to come in the Barrow Maze, so we'll see you next time.